Good morning and afternoon. Thank you for joining us. If you were trying to join Introduction to Identifiers, Advancing the NIAID Blueprint, you are in the right place. I'm Christine Kirkpatrick from GoFair US and the San Diego Supercomputer, joined by several colleagues today. We're going to give you a lively presentation with plenty of time for discussion at the end. So please feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A, and we will answer the easy ones that we can in text, and we'll keep the ones that need a little more discussion for the end. Um, I'd like to turn it over to my good colleague Reed Chapman from NIAID.
Thanks, Christine. Can you hear me okay?
Great.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you to all of you for joining today. We're really excited to kick off this webinar series in 2026. And sort of the premise behind it is the fact that this is kind of hosted both by our office, the Office of Data Science and Emerging Technologies, or ODSET, and folks in Christine's world at GoFair US. Um, and one of the things that we wanted to do was, we've spent a lot of time in our office talking with folks at GoFair US and engaging with NIAID supported resources for quite a while. And this is all part of what we were calling, or are calling, the NIAID Data Landscaping and Verification Project, and that's highlighted below. Next slide. And one of the things that happened from this activity was, as we were engaging with individual subject matter experts across the domain space and across NIAID resources, we saw a number of common themes emerge and thought that perhaps maybe a practical next step would be to capture these themes in sort of consultation with experts, many of who are on the call right now. And we had something drafted called the NIAID Blueprint for Digital Objects. And the idea was what are some common themes that are straightforward, that if were adopted by data generators and folks that house data, would be would be practical ways to sort of connect data more effectively, with our overall goal of increasing the use of data in general. And this is not necessarily for us to just sort of read back to you what the blueprint sort of highlighted, because there's a lot of common themes and a lot of other activities that the folks around the USG and outside the USG are doing. But I did want to highlight the fact that there are specific elements within this blueprint that highlight, an ideal minimal metadata schema, minimal API specification, persistent identifiers, so potentially the points to consider with citation, and how we can kind of continue outreach and training. And to that end, we thought it'd be great to kind of share this, some of these thoughts, in a broader forum, which is what this is. And I think this is the last slide that I'm going to speak to, but I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who's going to walk through one theme around this blueprint, which is on the topic of persistent identifiers. And I will hand it over to you, Chris, to take it from here. So thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Reed. So I'm Chris Erdman. I'm part of the GoFair US group. You have a number of us here, and also San Diego Supercomputer Center as well. And you may have seen me in Open Science Land as well. So I'm happy to be here. I just wanted to give you sort of an overarching view of what we're going to talk about here today. So just some general ideas about understanding persistent identifiers, key characteristics, and just some common examples to work from. Also, PIDs in metadata, and in sort of the infrastructure that we use. Also, how they're used to sort of create and connect core PIDs. So like the some other additional examples of how you can make these connections, like using ORCID and other examples. So just also to start too, we just wanted to give you an idea of like sort of the focus. It's not exactly, really we're not going to cover everything here, but this is to give a starter, focus on some key points, and maybe we can follow up on some additional questions. So, what makes PIDs valuable? We often get this question, right? Why should I use them? One of the first points is that it's machine readable and actionable, so you can actually, work with them to exchange metadata to make them actionable, and then you can also use them for disambiguation, and this is highly relevant in these days with LLMs as well. So disambiguating entities, for instance, people, organizations. It helps you connect, all these different points in all the research that's being done. So we have an example from ViewPath DB graph. So this is work done by one of our colleagues, Doug Phillips, who used identifiers to start making all these connections when all these points were just not connected, and you can start making better sense of them. The other thing is open science indicators. So, using them to sort of understand how you're doing on sharing science and how you're doing on sharing data, sharing software, and all those sort of important aspects that we have to point to these days. And I have an example below too of some work done by PLOS with the French Open Science Monitor, where they highlight how open science indicators and PIDs can be highly relevant here. You know, one point here on citations and impact. So also one other point, important point is traceability and verified provenance and trusted reuse. This is again very important these days with like hallucinations and trying to connect, data and verify it. So just to give you like a really quick overview, identifiers are really around. They come, from this point in time where, back in the day we used to cite literature, we used to cite books, cite articles, and we had all these different labels to use. But with the web, and things changing and, just locations moving with web pages, you have things break, right? And one of the examples we have is the fragile nature of scholarly citations. HTTP 404 status code is one example you probably have run across, but there's others like 300 and 500 where just the link that you're using to a particular object is not working. It's gone. So really persistent identifiers come around, and they were developed a while back to address this challenge of persistence, right? And so that we could actually sort of continue to rely on that information that was linked to, that was cited. And this is often called link rot, right? So we have this example of this citation where it talks about, many of these articles are hard to reach or not found. And I've been part of studies too in astronomy where we found it even, even in more a greater percentage than this even. So this can be a problem, and PIDs sort of respond to that. They respond to this broken links problem, of locating sort of the underlying research data that has been cited. Um, we thought it would be good to, maybe address some of the other jargon terms that you might have heard associated with PIDs. So sometimes you hear URI or IRI, and it's nice to see like a really quick example below of like the short form, right? So it's just like identifier string that you see down below, and that's the example of this PLOS One journal identifier that we have here. And then you sort of, have to have that resolution aspect. So the URL, the HTTPS part of it, which, allows you sort of to link to that identifier. But then you get to that GUPRI, the globally unique persistent resolvable identifier concept, which is a lot more to it, right? So there's the fair aspects of exchanging metadata, the aspect that we talked about before with machine readability and actionability, but also organizational commitment, right? And having this sort of resolution service, where you can sort of always have a guaranteed resolution to the information that was associated. And then you have this compact URIs, queries, and you may have heard that too. And there's a representation down there of the same DOI. It has the prefix, right? with DOI colon associated with it. So this is kind of a nice visual way to see how PIDs, that this overview of PIDs and some of the associated jargon that you might encounter. So, one of the things about PIDs is it has a lot of things behind it, right? Like that you might not see. So there's ISO standards. You can see this example with DOIs, that it has a standard associated with it. Has it's a they're trusted registration agencies. This contractual persistence, right, that they have with their communities, and sort of the infrastructure and the metadata curation that go along with it, and some of that infrastructure includes some other things about tombstones. So we'll talk a little bit about that and the interoperability with other PIDs and policy and other community aspects behind it and the longevity, right? And so these are sort of all these governance pieces and other aspects that you don't necessarily see, but this is a lot of the work that goes into establishing that these things are persistent, right? So just to back up and say, what is a PID? It's a persistent identifier, globally unique, stable alphanumeric string that provides long-term identification and access to resources. So that's really just at the end of the day, the quick and dirty definition of it. But you can see all the other aspects involved in a PID, and you can see that they're also across all different aspects of the life cycle. So you can see some of the common PIDs that we'll talk about a little bit later, from orchids to roars. So, this is a very grave subject of tombstones, but this is a central concept too of persistent identifiers that, once you create a persistent identifier, it doesn't go away. It's always in a registry, right? And so in the example we provided, DOIs, right? The data site or cross-ref DOIs that you come across const, you know, in a consistent manner, they have this sort of registry of metadata associated with the PID. And so example you have here is this Pangea data set that went away, and it is an example pollen profile data set. So in many ways you keep around the information that existed with that citation, with the information that was connected, so you don't lose it. Another sort of aspect that we thought would be good to sort of demonstrate to you is the resolution aspect. So, in some ways they act a little bit different. So, in the case of ROAR, which is the an identifier for organizations, um, the domain is really where everything gets resolved, right? So roar.org, and then the identifier, you go to a page where it has all that information and sort of the underlying metadata, versus DOI, which will resolve to the actual publisher page, but you still have the registry keeping that information. So in the case that that link or that information goes away, you still have the registry like there. And so here's an example, right? So that same DOI example that we had, you can see it in the registry in DataSite Commons. So the information about it persists even if the page goes away. So some of the backing up to the blueprint, some of the common PIDs that we sort of identified in the blueprint are seen here. So DOIs, ROARs, Research Organization Registry ID, ORCID for Open Research and Contributor Identifier, and the resource identification for resources there. These are some of the common ones, but we have an appendix at the end of the slide deck that identifies more, because this space has a lot more, PIDs that you probably, can look at. So, but we wanted to identify some of the ones that we'll be talking about a little bit more as we continue on. So PIDs in practice, right? We wanted to use an example here of ORCID. And, you know, maybe many of you are familiar with this face, with this author, Stephen King. He also has a pen name, Richard Bachman. But also Richard Bachman was a Filipino sports player that also became a sports executive. So it's not that guy who also goes by the name Dickey. So what do orchids help us with? They help us identify the right person to link to the right person to disambiguate these people. And particularly, when you see some of these challenges with AI helps with sort of making the connection versus a hallucination. So providing that additional structure. And going back to the 404 example, that is also another case where hallucinations might actually make up some of these links as well. And it's also something that structure this our sort of underlying structure can help with. So with the orchid example, obviously this is like becoming more and more important at NIH. We included this example of the BioSketch common forms and ERA systems. And also you see this in sort of a lot of the policies and initiatives coming through too, is that orchid is becoming pretty central to the work that you're doing sort of with proposals and the research that you're doing. But as far as like an example of how you can benefit with Orchid and how these things interlink, you can actually the system sort of automates, and you can also work with automating this where when you use an Orchid, when you publish, or when you deposit data, they can be interlinked with each other. So we'll provide these slides later, and you can actually look through these links too. But just to give you an example, so when um, when an author sort of publishes with a journal, and this example comes from eLife, um, they eLife will register that ORCID, within Crossref, right? So that ends up being indexed and available in the metadata, but then that automation signals to other places as well that this is a connected author through their ORCID, and you can exchange information through that identifier. So that's one example. So if you have an ORCID record and you've turned on automation, then it will appear in your ORCID record, and you can actually sort of open it up and say that yes, this is mine, and make that connection. And vice versa in the journal articles, they're sort of alerted too. And this is the Orchid example. So they on their end they register the DOI associated, so the digital object identifier associated with that article, and you can see it here where it gets indexed, and all this gets sort of linked and automated so that you can actually exchange information better. So all those links are available, so you can inspect the metadata a little bit further, but these are just some examples to help you. So another aspect is identifiers in journals, right? And this journals have varying policies sometimes. They are harmonizing them a bit more. But like you have various places where identifiers can exist sometimes, and where you can track them. And so one of the sort of places where people gravitated to is data availability statements or reference lists, right? So adding your, the identifier and the references, but also the DOS as they call it. But also there's sort of alternative models, right? So the RRIDs, the research resources, include this in the body of the paper. And then in other cases I've worked in, sometimes, just speaking to this last point, is that sometimes you can't access the actual publication. And so, having a little bit more flexibility and sort of having these identifiers available and acknowledgments or abstracts can help you. And I've done this in other places where I've been, where we played boilerplate statements where we track the work that's being done, that researchers will use when they publish, so that we know how to find it and link it to all these other things. So just to give you an idea of what a DOS might look like, this is work that I have done in the past at AGU, which We developed these sort of simple templates that authors can use, and you can see it has various information in it, like the source and description, and but also the identifier, right? And really at the end of the day, you want to provide as much information as possible so that uh, others can identify and understand the underlying research. And the identifier is really the best way to do that often. And again, eLife is an example here. It all stems from work like done from others like Melissa Harrison and others at eLife, where they worked hard on implementing this DOS approach to indexing the identifiers and their references. So it's nice to see sort of this example, but they tend to have one of the better indexed linked identifiers out there for journals. And one of the other things to sort of note here is that when the publications go through copy editing, the identifiers sometimes are not exactly known to the copy editors. And so, in some ways, you have to identify to them that this is a data set or this is software so that they can parse it properly. So that might be why sometimes your identifiers and citations and links like that are not appearing. So that's another important point to have here. And then the other side of it is that authors sometimes forget that they have to go back into their data deposits and relate the publication to their data. They're very focused on the publication aspect, and so provide a DOI for a data set in their publication. And then, like once it's published, they sometimes won't go back and provide the DOI of that publication. So like that's one of these sort of other important pieces, that to think about. And here's a Zenodo example, of related identifiers where you would add something like that. Um, Another thing to show you is identifiers in web pages, right? So we have people that run infrastructure, and identifiers can be very helpful when you're presenting pages about information. Again, having direct link to that information that a machine can read, but also can help with that disambiguation, that context negotiation that happens. And so, in this example, we pulled a Zenodo NIAID data set that tends to be the most viewed one, and um, it has this DOI associated with it. Zenodo tends to be one of the better examples of how they include this in their page. So they have header metadata where the DOI is listed, and then they also have the schema context, right? So this metadata also linked so that these search tools um, can actually index it as well in a machine readable way. But you can also see the identifier here. Um, the one thing to note here is that sometimes, again, this points back to the challenges sometimes with DOIs is that you can see here Zenodo has a record. They have the identifier here, but they have a different URL, and the publisher can present a different URL and change this, but the DOI is persistent. It's always going to point to that. But that's why you always want to use this. And we do see this often where the URL of Zenodo or one of the repositories is used versus a DOI. And if you want to delve further into this topic, we have some other information on signposting that could be something you want to read up on further. But it talks about more things you can do within your web pages with linking to DOIs. Another important topic that we can't exactly cover today, but we've heard when we had interactions with a lot of people in the community in at NIAID is local identifier. So one of the examples is maybe you have samples and you have a local identifier system to for those samples. And one of the things with that is that you can change things as well locally, right? And sort of local identifiers can be sort of problematic in that sense, unless if you sort of incorporate best practices but also sort of map it globally to some PID frameworks. And I think this is a topic we will cover later, as you can see there, and sort of delve into a little bit more. But it definitely is one of those things where you also want sort of those local identifiers to have sort of that mapping and be a little bit more persistent as well. And so we have maybe some tips for you as well. If you wanted to stay with us in this series, there will be more information about that. So, the role of PIDs in reproducibility and research evaluation impact is another topic. And, one of the things, working with funders in the past is, like one of the other things is that persistent identifiers can help with is they can almost be like a trust marker, right? They can signal that this research has like deposited their data. They've, shared their data, they shared their software, they shared all this sort of underlying research outputs like protocols as well. And it starts indicating sort of like that, if you read this publication or you use this publication, that there's underlying research associated with it that helps you understand it further. And so, there are a number of sort of publications out there, research that sort of points to this. But we also, like the other part of this is that the other piece of this is that your information is disconnected, right? And I think, again, understanding your research becomes harder, and this is one of the things I heard often sometimes with the published research that was coming through, is that it's hard to sometimes trust it, and so this can be one of those signals, but it's also part of NIH initiatives. You can see here with this replication and reproducibility initiative, but also with what you see coming through with gold standard science and some other policies initiatives that my colleagues are probably better equipped on the call to speak to. Um, this is also something that is becoming more and more prevalent within organizations, is to look at how do we look at how do we evaluate research beyond maybe publications? How do we, like look at the sort of broader, work that's happening? And you can see some of these pieces really start out like identifying contributions in different ways. One of the other things that we haven't necessarily spoken about are grant IDs, right? So DOIs or, other things the other identifiers that can help associate, some of the research that's happening. And think we spoke about related identifiers, that the links between all these things are increasingly important, right? You see a lot of DOIs out there, a lot of orchids, and trying to connect them is highly valuable. And it's perhaps a good time to mention another initiative too called RAID for research activity identifiers that's hoping to pull all that information together and link it together. And there's a pilot for that if you're interested as well. So a good example, um, for the work that's being done in this space, I've pointed it to them before, but PLOS really does a lot of work to to really look in their research and look at their policies and how they can update them to advance data sharing, advance software. And so they're doing a lot of work to mine all this information. And what helps are these identifiers, right, for associating software or data. And they share a lot of this work that is being done on their blog. So I encourage you to have a look. But they also work with a lot of other actors in the space. So the French Open Science Monitor is one, but there's other cases out there that that are doing this work. But this just tends to be a really good example, right, to look through. And they are also, I don't know if it's available yet, but they are also looking at a way to visualize all this work that's being done to sort of look at how their policies having impact and how people are sharing and how to improve upon it. So maybe stay tuned, or maybe it's available on their blog. So And the last thing I just wanted to bring up is we thought it would be good to bring up an example. Um, there are people working on this at NIAD that we talked to, and this is just a really simple example to start, but we can probably bring up others maybe, but that the NIAD data ecosystem and its discovery portals where a lot of this information is being interlinked. And this example here is with import, right? So import is one of the repositories in the system where they've done this linking with funder information, and you can start sort of researchers can start connecting some of this information and understanding what has been, what work has happened under sort of particular funding. We can talk a little bit more about examples, but um, coming up on time, and I think I just wanted to relay, like we'll have other sessions. Again, this is really just this. We try to find a balance of talking about identifiers and giving some examples to you and have it as a starting point. But we'll also have conversations, discussions, and presentations around, other metadata aspects as well as you see here and impact. And so we hope you join us at these sessions. And it'll be great to have you at those and talk about this a bit further. So I'll pass it over to my colleague Christine to
Yeah,
talk
thank
about
you.
this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. And I want to remind people that they can put any questions they have, even if your question is open-ended and this thing you want to hear more about, not a specific question per se, put it in the Q&A tool. We just want to thank all of the staff at NIH, and particularly the repositories that we worked with at NIAD that helped throughout this fair landscaping project. That led to the blueprint. And of course, our funder, Leidos, and the National Cancer Institute. So with that, we can stop sharing the slides and move to Q&A or discussion.
Thanks, Christine. I mean, I think, Chris, thank you for the presentation. It was a great perspective on kind of the ground state of all the different activities around persistent identifiers. I think, I don't know, Christine, if you had any additional thoughts that came to your mind while Chris was presenting, while folks are maybe thinking about any questions that they have.
Yeah, I think hopefully there are things for people at both ends of the spectrum. We know we have people on this call who are like the world experts on some of these things, and then people who are trying to figure out what is a DOI past, or sorry, what's an identifier past a DOI. And so hopefully there was something for each. For those who are just getting started with identifiers, hopefully you all have ORCIDs. You need them to apply for federal funding to create your CV. But you can also do so much more with them than that. And Chris showed a couple slides where there were examples of the different PIDs that are called out in the blueprint, and they give you some ways that you can work in additional PIDs. These let you do a number of cool things, including set the stage for creating knowledge graphs and for doing analysis later of impact. So, Chris, was there anything that you would like to see if we did an extending persistent identifiers, things you would have included?
Well, you saw that we get those questions about local identifiers. So that's there are many examples, right? We have the identifiers.org as an example here, but I think that is one area that we hear that would be great to sort of have a little bit more information on. But I think one of the things I've encountered is that people often say, I've done this, I've cited my data, and I'm just not seeing the usage, or I'm not seeing, come up in all these systems. And I think that's the work that, I was pointing to, is that, like some of those things that you have to do within the publications, and like cite it certain ways, and is that we are starting to see a little bit more of that come through. But I think that that's the other side of it is that, would be great to tackle this from the start too and have a way to sort of interlink all this work together, like and so, that's why we have that pilot with RAID as well, right? For research activity identifier to help with interlinking all these different outputs, right? Because otherwise you get kind of this hairball of things that it's hard to make sense of, right? Sometimes, and it's so important to the contributions that happen that when we're looking at research assessment and evaluation, the recognition of the work that goes on is that we can sort of enable the system, the foster the system to do this. And so, if anyone is interested, in the pilot, it would be great to have your use case as well as RAID becomes more full-fledged. Um,
Yeah, well, and Chris, we can put some of those links in the chat, which I think the we can send to all panelists. I know it's different, or sorry, to all attendees. We've got two questions. The first one might be more towards Reed or someone in Oddset. It's from David Lowe, who asks, "What is the latest on assigning DOIs to awarded grants? Might funders be doing the DOI assignment, or should institutions plan on doing their own if they want?"
That is a great question. Above my pay grade. So I will, but I think what we'll do is maybe take that back as something to try to find out. So I think there's probably a lot of folks on the call that are doing similar activities, in the USG and in other places. But I think sort of a more broad, like meta answer to the question is going back towards, I think one of the things that we alluded to, or Chris alluded to, is like, how do we get to the level of a publication? We weight publications very high, but sort of the citation of data sets or a grant or other things beyond publications, where can we start to make it easier to give attribution and sort of to track those things so that it kind of all supports the sphere. And so I think DOIs to award of grants is a great idea, and those are types of things that are good. And taking it back to the PIDs, I mean, those are kind of the ways that you can use these identifiers to get to a place where you have persistence and citing things that will last. So I don't know if that answers the question beyond. We will take that back. I think it's a great conceptual idea. I can't answer that specific situation. What I can say is I think these are the types of questions that folks are thinking about constantly. Is like, how do we elevate, you know, how do we go from concept to implementation of DUIs and other things? Over to you, Christine.
Yeah, we have got another question. Someone asks, does Scopus author ID count as a PID? And what about Web of Science researcher IDs?
well, I mean, Reed, do you want to? I saw
Take a
you.
stab at it. No, you please take it. Please go ahead.
No, so they exist in that identifier space, right? So they're all interlinked with each other. So like, but this might. I think that was my short answer to it, but you might want to speak to it from like the sort of NIAID, perspective, and so I'll cede the floor to you.
Well, you're the subject matter expert on this, Chris, so I don't want to get too far out of my swim lane. I mean, I think I understand the question is, you know, to me is kind of the word counts. Does Scopus author ID count as a PID? And so I think the short answer is yes, it does. And what about Web of Science researcher IDs? So I think it kind of comes back to, and I think we'd like to take community feedback on this, right? So there are multiple ways to do things, to have persistent identification around researchers, authors, those types of things, and that can become obviously complex. And so, one of the things that we've sort of thought about is like, what are all the different ways to represent um, things through persistent identifiers, and maybe there's different ontologies or whatever, or different methods, um, and sort of how to connect to those things. I don't know if you could maybe elaborate on that, Chris, but I think it's kind of to me, it's sort of the connection of existing, what's practical in connecting these different IDs.
Well, that's the theme here, right? Like it's exactly the case where you can sort of connect your ORCID to, these identifiers and vice versa, right? So that's, what these all enable you to do, right? So I think that's probably the simple answer. There is yes, you can connect these things. So
Well, in the important, whether it's Scopus or Web of Science, I think the important concept is it persistent, right? Um, is it globally unique? And there are certain PIDs in the blueprint that we saw in use and that folded into some other strategy and policy documents. But certainly, these are also good things to use. We have a comment and a question from Srinivas Shapuri, who says Import is currently collaborating with identifiers.org to register import study identifiers as persistent identifiers. Very cool. We would like to understand the recommended approach and requirements for extending this model to additional local identifiers, such as subject identifiers and experiment accession identifiers, and formally registering them as persistent identifiers. So that sounds like, oh, go ahead, Chris.
no, and I think that's like I mean I don't think there's additionally to say there is that we will have, like we'll probably reach out and that will be like the topic of another session, like but I think like there's definitely some things you can do, and they're already doing some of them that are good, right? Like, which are already sort of mapping to a global identifier system like identifiers.org, right? And so that's already out of the gate. That's a good example. But then there's sort of underlying best practices, which are probably best, to wrangle through on a further session or talking to them later about how to sort of handle that so you can sort of maintain some persistence, So,
Chris, could we
um,
take a step back? I mean, it's an excellent question and really exciting. I mean, I think, could you just kind of quickly give just sort of a high level, like what we're talking about, or what when we're talking about local identifiers, subject specific identifiers, and how those might be different than persistent identifiers?
yeah, yeah, it's a local system you've used. Like I use the example, which I've come across recently, samples, and you sort of create your own sort of identifier system, but associated metadata with it, right? And you have a system sort of to assign that unique ID. But in some of these local systems, they can move, right? Like the concept that we had with PIDs is that, the systems like DOIs, right? They provide that persistence, right? So like in case it moves or changes, there's something that sort of registers that there's some information related to it, right? And so that's what we're just talking about, I think, with best practices with those, is that the metadata, that you have sort of systems in place to register, to version that information, so that it's not lost. And then ultimately, like, look at some of the schemas that are used globally and how you can maybe map, to them and make them better available. I know of certain cases where repositories will often understand, wrangle with how do they sort of include one of these, systems, so that it helps with curating and sometimes people don't see that other side of it as like, we can expose it and make it available, also to these systems so they can easily use it. And so there's a lot to unravel there, but that may hopefully that helps read with a little bit more
Yeah, I was
information.
just trying to give some context to, I mean, from, and I'm not the subject matter expert in this space by any means, but I think what Import is saying in this comment is, and I think this is true for a lot of data resources, is you have kind of local identifiers, a unique identifier for something that either a biosample or data itself that lives in a resource. Um, but that's distinct from persistent, right? And that's sort of that permanent, which you discussed for the last several minutes. And so the question is, we'd like to understand the recommended approach and requirements And I mean, to there, I mean, we'd also like to learn from imports, I think, we're sort of I think Chris was sort of speaking conceptually, right? Persistence is good. Um, and how it's always good to go in that direction. So understanding how you're working with identifiers.org to that specific end with import would be fascinating. So I'll stop it there. Go to
Yeah,
the
and
next
and
question.
they're a great example. They do come up often, and I'm channeling Christine. Maybe she was about to say this, but the best practices are good enough practices. Because some people have challenges with best practices, but you have like the good, better, best as well. Like what can you do? Because I think we also hinted on that slide. There's also sort of these challenges you have to get around with resources and what you can actually do locally too. So yeah, but
Yeah, well, and I did want to put in a plug for those who are part of the repository liaisons group that just began and that's being led by Nancy Hobel-Heinrich from Knowledge Motifs. The next one will be on the topic of identifiers to really drill into some of these uh, kind of more advanced topics and to get your feedback on what other support or programming that this community could use. On a related note, also Sammy Smith, also from the NIH import team, thank you for the nice comment, Sammy, asked about, um, well, let me start with the last question. How can we retroactively apply some of these concepts to existing publications, data sets, and software? The underlying question is about aligning current and future ideal usage of PIDs, where authors of publications are using PIDs for their associated data and software with older things, this vast collection of publications in the world that has not done that. So how do you move forward in the kind of good, better, best way when you're trying to link to things that did not do that?
yeah, and that's an interesting. There's actually, I'll use one example, which is a project called SoFair. They're working on software, right, and trying to index it, and they had to wrangle with this too, of like assigning an identifier when it didn't exist, and to have that available where they could start linking all these different publications and other outputs to it. So there's this post curation that's happening, right? And it's not just So Fair. There's other places that do this. Europe PMC does this, and I mean, there's a lot of other examples out there, but this post curation is like what a lot of groups are working on. So that's one way to do it. But then you're also going to come across like some of these challenges of, do you register a PID for something, does that result in duplication, or, like some of those challenges, and the challenges of interlinking those things when you have this post curation. And I think that's where we, like that idea of related identifiers and having something to sort of tie all this together in like something like a research activity identifier is helpful here. If where you don't necessarily have to, you can have some of these systems that you have for identifiers, and list them, and index them, and then allow for this curation to come in, and maybe link to a PID that already exists, or so in some ways you have this flexible approach where you can start interlinking these things, and then like other groups, other systems can start like saying, oh, we found that PID for that, or but that's just sort of one way to sort of answer that question. So yeah.
Yes, another approach, I guess I could say it's being developed, but also in use, is the concept of a fair digital object. And so this is the idea that you create a metadata record and assign a PID to it, and then a master object, and you're pointing at maybe some other links. Um, so that gives you a way to wrap an object that you don't own. Has many different use cases, but this might be one that works there. And if anyone in this community has an approach that they like that has been working for them, we would love to propagate to the rest. Because I think this is something that comes up a lot, especially as you're trying to trace reproducibility of research and what you've built, your foundations on. Okay, next question. What role do publishers play in helping with linkage between different PIDs? If they move too slow, what can the community do outside? If they move too slow, what can the community do outside the publishers?
That's a good question. So I used to work with on the publishing side as well, and there's sort of a lot of things here, right? Like, so there's the policy side, community side to start, right? So having those policies in place, and then also sort of working with the editors and specialists and other people involved with index, helping with authors follow the policy. So that's one side of it, and also getting it down to something that's simple, right? And so one of the things I did was work with specialists to understand, how they could help authors, get share this, share persistent identifiers. And the other side of it is working with infrastructure, right? So like you have these copy editing services, you have these indexing services where you have to sort of work through some of the challenge points of why, they did this DOI or why did this other identifier not make it, into the indexing, like, and that's, one of those examples that I mentioned where you have to kind of signal that this is a different type, right? Like this is a data set, this is software, like this has to be treated differently. And it also has to be a signal to these systems, to sort of understand that too. So there's a lot involved there, like in the whole publishing process, to do these things. So I hope that gives you a good view of it.
Yeah, and John Graybill on our team raises a good point. I'll just tack on that most of these PIDs that were mentioned were not created in the publishing realm and have found a way to proliferate without the publishers driving it. We might also look to models in the geosciences, for example. One of the ways that this has been promoted and promulgated within different publishers in that domain is through this consortium called COPDES, COPDESS, the Coalition for Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences. And partially led by AGU, but really a group of people, like-minded people and repositories and publishers who got together and said, these are the ways we think this should be done as a way to try and push the noodle sometimes with the publishers, but actually ended up being led by some of the publishers as well. So maybe these are models, if they aren't in use already at NIAD in this community, models that could be tried.
So Christine, looks like we have we have 2 questions left and try to end a couple minutes early so folks can make it to their next call.
Yeah,
We could try to answer the last 2 pretty quickly and maybe follow up. I think we have the names of folks so we can follow up too more comprehensively.
sounds
Time check.
great.
Okay.
Okay, our next question comes from Randy Vita. Will you be giving guidance on the reuse of existing PIDs versus each resource or project minting its own when cross-referencing the same data?
Oh, I was gonna let you do that, Christine, but that comes back to our the blueprint, right? And that's the start of all this, right? So it's really sort of the beginnings of this guidance, but we also have some other resources that we'll link out to, like particularly maybe one of the examples is often we find that projects don't understand exactly how this all works and how to cite their project and how to cite these resources. And so, having those templates available can be really helpful for them as well. And so, yeah, like the blueprint is really where we start, with all these things and build off of. So, and this sounds like Reed is gonna jump on.
I just want to make a quick point here, and that is that, I get hesitant with the word guidance because we want to hear from you. So Randy, I agree with Chris. What we put together was trying to get to this question, but it's probably incomplete. And so, like, I think the question would be, um, we could take this back and we could maybe follow up with you with sort of some thoughts, but would like to sort of, co-develop that guidance that makes sense, that's grounded in reality. Yeah, over.
Well, and I think that's the last question. We had a great comment from Jana Paula that we will take in, and thank you for that. With that, I think I'd like to close the webinar, close the recording. Thank you all for your time. If you have other thoughts on this topic, we'd love to hear from you. And for those of you who are part of the liaisons call, we can't wait to discuss some of these things with you. The slides will be available and the recording will also be made available. And we will follow up with you with that. But thank you again.
And thanks for my side too.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Christine.